Welcome to another edition of Live and Lead, biblical lessons on leadership. You know, a few years ago, I remember reading someone who wrote that the key to success is elusive, but the key to failure is not. The person said, if you want to fail, it's easy. Just try to please everyone. It's like a pastor who is called to a church, the church vote. And the vote is 97%. Anybody on any day would like 97% of the people to be supportive. But what does that pastor think about the 3% who voted against him? Criticism bothers us. Opposition disturbs us. And many times opposition will rob us of the vision, and criticism will rob us of the vision that God has given us. And many times we'll simply give up. You know, Nehemiah was a man who was called by God to leave the luxury of the palace in Persia and go to the destruction of a city in Jerusalem to help the Jewish people rebuild the walls. And as he made his way there and surveyed the damage and then rallied the Jews, we learned some incredible lessons. Some of those we talked about last week about leadership. And one of those lessons that I want to talk about today has to do with criticism. And I want you to think about criticism by getting three words in your mind. The word prepare, the word pray, and the word proceed. The first word is prepare. Anybody who leads needs to understand that criticism is part of the job. Andy Stanley once wrote that when you have a vision, there is more knowledge on the what side than there is on the how side. A lot of people can understand the what, they don't understand the how. And that's when the questions and the criticism begins to arise. You recall in the book of Nehemiah, even after Nehemiah casted the vision, there were three gentlemen, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, who stood in opposition to him. In chapter 4, their opposition is mounted against him, and not only against him, those who were working with him to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. He mocked them and he said, "Will these feeble Jews restore this wall?" In other words, they can't do it. And they were trying, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, to discourage the Jewish people from building the wall. Criticism is part of the job. Don't be surprised by it. Expect it. So the first word I want you to understand is prepare. But the second word I want you to understand is pray. Because what did Nehemiah do when he was faced with his critics? Well, he took his critics to the Lord. In fact, in chapter 4 and verse 3, as they criticize him, Nehemiah cries out to God in verse 4, "Hear our God, for we are despised." He took the criticism to the Lord. And let me tell you why that's important. It's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it helps us to take our focus off of our critics and to put our focus on where our focus needs to be, on seeking the Lord. It's so easy to get distracted when people stand in opposition of us. It's so easy to be deterred and to begin to focus our attention on them. We need to take our focus back to God. My football coach at college used to say, remember to live your life for an audience of one. You're not living your life for the audience of all of the critics and all of the people around you. You're living your life to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to please God and to do what God asks you to do and what God tells you to do with your life. So Nehemiah took his concerns not to the critics, but he took his concerns to God. But there's a second reason why it's important to take our concerns to God, and that is because sometimes criticism might be warranted. Sometimes criticism might be sent to us from God to get our attention. The company L.L. Bean was fond of saying, for every one complaint they receive, there are probably 25 complaints they don't receive. Sometimes God has a purpose in allowing criticism to creep into our lives because He wants to get our attention so that we will maybe go a different direction, maybe tap the brakes. So we need to be sure that we take our criticism to Him. One, to keep our focus on Him and not on our critics. And two, to ask if God has something He wants to say to us. Whenever I think about that, I think about a man named King David. David was going through a region called the Baharim, and there was a man named Shimei. Shimei couldn't stand David and was throwing rocks at him. And one of David's men said, hey, let me go and, the Bible puts it, let me dispatch of his head. Let me take away your critic. And David said something very interesting in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 11. He says, leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be, David said, that the Lord has a message in this criticism for me. So whenever we're criticized, don't focus on the critics, focus on the Lord, and focus on what God might be saying to you through them. Prepare, know that criticism is coming. Pray, take your critics to the Lord. And lastly, proceed. You know what Nehemiah did? In fact, in verse 6 it says, so we built the wall, and the wall was joined together. Nehemiah didn't leave his work to deal with his critics. He kept doing his work in spite of the critics. And do you know why Nehemiah did that? Nehemiah did that because he knew it was a God-shaped vision. He knew that God had placed it in his heart. He had taken all of this before the Lord even prior to leaving the Persian Empire and making his way to Jerusalem. And he knew that the vision was God-sized. And when it's a God-sized vision and God leads you to do it, don't stop what you're doing just because there are those that don't agree with what you're doing. Remember, the key to success may be elusive, but the key to failure is trying to please your critics, especially those critics that don't have the vision that God had given you. There's an incredible passage in the Bible about this. You guys remember when Peter was in the boat in the middle of the sea and the storm was upon them, and Jesus was walking on the water? In the book of Matthew chapter 14 and verse 28, Peter said something to Jesus, and I want to close by reminding you of this. Peter said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you. In other words, God, if it's okay for me to walk on water, and if it's okay for you for me to walk on water, if it's your vision that I do this, Lord, invite me to come out to the water. And it was then that Peter stepped out of the boat and he walked on water. Sure, he sank, and there's a lesson there for all of us. But Peter walked on water. Why? Because Jesus gave him permission to do that. God called Nehemiah. He gave him the vision. Nehemiah took his critics to the Lord. And then Nehemiah continued to build the wall the way that God had intended him to build the wall. Expect that criticism will come. Take all of that criticism to God. Let God tell you if he has a message for you in it. And if he continues to give you the leadership, follow through with the vision that he has planted in your heart.